$200,000, Preston Hale said, as if the number itself were proof that no one else in the room had the right to question him. The red supercar sat motionless beneath the white showroom lights at Sterling Crown Motors, its polished body reflecting rows of glass walls, chrome displays, and technicians in spotless uniforms. Olivia Hart stood beside the driver's door with her phone lowered in one hand and a look of controlled disbelief on her face. The car was supposed to carry her to a foundation event that evening. Instead, it had arrived on a flatbed, refused every reset, and spent 4 hours connected to diagnostic equipment that cost more than most people's houses. Preston stood at the front of the car with a tablet against his chest. He explained that the central control unit, power distribution module, and part of the drivetrain communication network would all need to be replaced. Parts, labor, programming, and calibration brought the estimate to just over $200,000. Olivia asked whether there was another option. Preston gave the patient smile of a man accustomed to being believed. Not if you want it repaired correctly. That was when Mason Reed entered through the service door carrying a small cardboard box of ordered connectors for the dealership's secondary garage. His gray work shirt was faded at the elbows, and a thin line of grease remained beneath one thumbnail despite repeated washing. Chloe walked beside him with a red toy car tucked under her arm and a school backpack hanging from one shoulder. No one looked at them at first. Then the warning light inside the supercar blinked again. Mason stopped. It flashed once, paused, then flickered twice before going dark. Preston noticed him staring. "Delivery goes to the rear counter," he said. Mason did not move. He listened as a relay clicked somewhere beneath the rear panel, followed by the faint whir of a cooling fan that started 3 seconds later than it should have. "The system is not dead," Mason said. The nearest technician glanced up. Preston let out a short laugh. "You would not understand this system." Chloe tightened her grip on the toy car. Mason looked at her once, then back at the vehicle. He did not defend himself. He did not mention the years he had spent diagnosing electrical faults that appeared only under heat and load. He simply nodded toward the instrument display. "That warning pattern does not match a failed control unit." Olivia turned toward him for the first time. Her eyes moved from his worn boots to the box in his hands. "And what does it match?" Mason studied the car through the open driver's door. The warning light flickered again. One pause. 2 flashes. Then silence. "A signal dropping after the circuit gets warm," he said. Preston closed the tablet cover. "We have already scanned every module." Mason's expression did not change. "Did you test it hot?" The showroom went quiet for half a second. One technician looked toward the floor. Another pretended to adjust a cable. Preston answered too quickly. "That is not relevant." Mason said nothing more, but Olivia noticed the way Preston shifted his weight and moved between Mason and the open service panel. She also noticed something else. For the first time since the car had arrived, someone had asked a question no one in the dealership seemed willing to answer. Olivia did not answer immediately. She looked from Mason to Preston, then toward the open rear service panel where 2 technicians stood beside a cart of diagnostic equipment, each of them suddenly interested in something other than the conversation. The showroom lights reflected across the red bodywork in long white lines, clean enough to make the car look perfect from 20 feet away. Up close, the silence felt less perfect. Mason set the box of connectors on the rear counter and adjusted the strap of Chloe's backpack before she slipped it from one shoulder. She stayed beside him without speaking, the small red toy car pressed against her chest. Olivia studied Mason more carefully now. He did not look like someone trying to impress her. He looked like someone waiting for the room to stop getting in the way of the answer. "What makes you think heat is involved?" she asked. Preston stepped in before Mason could respond. "Because he heard a relay click from across the room," he said. "That is not a diagnosis." Mason turned his attention toward the car. "No," he said. "It is a reason to keep testing." His voice remained level. He pointed toward the warning indicator inside the cabin. The control unit still stores memory. The fan still receives a delayed command. The main relay still closes. If the system were fully dead, those things would not happen in sequence. One of the younger technicians glanced at Preston, then lowered his eyes. Olivia noticed. Mason continued only because she had asked. A cold scan can look normal when a connection fails after resistance rises. If the voltage drops under load, the computer reports failures farther down the chain. Then every module looks guilty. Preston folded his arms. This vehicle has been tested by factory-certified technicians. I did not say they were unqualified. Mason looked toward the service cart. I said the test may have ended too early. The distinction seemed to unsettle Preston more than an insult would have. Olivia walked closer to the open panel. A faint smell of heated plastic lingered beneath the sharper scent of showroom polish. It was slight, but once Mason had mentioned heat, she could not ignore it. Did anyone test the circuit after the engine bay reached operating temperature? She asked. Preston replied that the vehicle would not start, making operating temperature irrelevant. Mason looked at the compact thermal lamp resting on the diagnostic cart. You do not need the engine running to heat the circuit safely. The younger technician shifted again. Preston saw it this time. Evan, he said, finish clearing the fault history. The technician nodded but did not move toward the tablet. Olivia turned to him. Was a heat load test performed? Evan hesitated. Preston answered for him. We followed the required procedure. Mason said nothing. He reached down and picked up Chloe's toy car after it slipped from her arm onto the tile. One of its plastic wheels had come loose. He pressed it back into place, handed it to her, and waited. Olivia watched the small repair, then the man who had made it without calling attention to himself. You still have not told me who you are, she said. Mason Reed. And you work for the parts distributor? No. I own a garage on Mercer Street. They asked me to deliver the order because their driver called out. Preston smiled without warmth. A neighborhood mechanic. Chloe looked up at him, but Mason did not. Olivia saw the grease beneath his thumbnail, the worn cuff of his shirt, and the complete absence of embarrassment in the way he stood. If I gave you 5 minutes, she asked, what would you test first? Mason looked past Preston toward the smallest relay box in the open compartment. The part no one thought was expensive enough to matter. Mason did not get the 5 minutes yet. Olivia asked Preston to pause the estimate, and the delay exposed something no one in the showroom expected. The man in the gray work shirt knew exactly how the dealership's diagnostic process was supposed to work. He did not touch the car. He stood near the service line with Chloe beside him and watched Evan clear the fault history, restart the scan, and read the same chain of communication errors that had already led the team toward the most expensive conclusion. Mason listened to the relays, watched the timing of the fan, and counted the seconds between the warning light and the system reset. He had done that kind of work for nearly a decade before Mercer Street, before school pickups, before he learned how to rebuild his schedule around a 7-year-old girl who still asked for her mother when storms woke her at night. Years earlier, Mason had worked in the advanced diagnostics division of a performance vehicle manufacturer in Michigan, where the cars arrived only after dealership technicians and regional specialists had failed to find the problem. He had not been the loudest engineer in the room. He had been the one who stayed after everyone else left, running the same test under different temperatures, loads, and vibration until the fault stopped hiding. Walter Hayes, an electrical specialist with 40 years of experience and a habit of carrying the same analog meter long after the company replaced it, had taught him the rule Mason trusted more than any scan tool. A code tells you where the system gave up. Walter would say. It does not tell you why. One winter, a limited production coupe had arrived with 3 failed control modules, 2 replacement harnesses, and a repair history thick enough to fill a binder. The warning pattern had looked almost identical to the one blinking inside Olivia's car now. Mason had found the real fault in a relay that tested perfectly when cold and opened only after heat raised the resistance inside a cracked contact. The part had cost less than dinner. The misdiagnosis had already cost the company nearly $60,000. Mason remembered the rhythm because certain failures developed a language if you listened long enough. One blink. A pause. Two shorter flashes. Then silence. He had planned to stay in that job until Chloe was grown. Then his wife, Emily, became ill during the year Chloe turned 4. Hospital visits replaced late shifts. Medication schedules replaced travel. When Emily died, Mason stopped accepting assignments that kept him away overnight. 6 months later, he opened the small garage on Mercer Street, close enough to Chloe's school that she could sit at his workbench after class and finish homework while he repaired delivery vans, family sedans, and whatever else kept the lights on. Preston saw only the faded shirt and the delivery box. Olivia saw something different now. Mason was not guessing. He was recognizing. Aaron Blake, Olivia's assistant, entered from the front office carrying the complete diagnostic report. Mason did not ask to see all of it. He asked for the test sequence. Aaron handed him the pages. He read them once, then stopped at the same missing line he had expected to find. Every module had been scanned cold. None had been tested under sustained electrical load after controlled heating. Mason looked toward the open compartment, where one connector showed a faint amber discoloration around its edge. The smell of warmed plastic was stronger there. Preston moved closer and closed the service panel halfway. "That test is unnecessary," he said. Mason handed the report back to Aaron. "Then why is it the only one missing?" Olivia kept her eyes on the incomplete test sequence for several seconds, before turning toward Preston. The showroom had grown quieter, not because anyone had been asked to stop working, but because every technician close enough to hear understood what the missing test meant. Preston closed the service panel another inch and said the dealership had already followed factory procedure. Mason looked at the amber discoloration around the connector and said nothing. Aaron held the report against her chest. Chloe stood beside the painted service boundary with the red toy car in both hands, watching her father the way children watch someone they trust when every adult in the room appears uncertain. Olivia stepped closer to the car. "Open the panel," she said. Preston did not move. "Olivia, this vehicle is under our care. If someone without dealership authorization interferes with the system, we cannot guarantee the integrity of the repair." Mason shifted his weight but did not answer for her. Olivia looked at him. "How long do you need?" 5 minutes to test the circuit," Mason said. "Longer if you want the cause." Preston gave a short, controlled breath. "And if he damages a module?" "Then I will accept responsibility for authorizing the test," Olivia said. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Evan unlocked the service cart and stepped aside. Mason placed the delivery box near the wall, then crouched beside Chloe so they were eye level. He told her to stay behind the yellow line and asked whether she still had her math worksheet. She nodded. "Finish number 6, he said. "I will be right there." Chloe sat in a leather waiting chair, set the toy car on her knee, and opened her backpack. Mason walked toward the vehicle carrying a small canvas tool roll he kept behind the seat of his truck. It contained no polished dealership equipment, only a digital meter with worn corners, a load light, insulated leads, a compact temperature probe, and a few relays stored in clear plastic sleeves. Preston watched him unroll it on a clean service mat. "That is what you intend to use?" he asked. Mason connected the meter to the primary circuit. "It measures voltage. Our equipment measures the entire network." "Your equipment told you where?" Communication stopped. Mason clipped the load lead into place. "I am looking for what made it stop." The first reading was normal. Battery voltage held steady. The primary relay closed. The control module woke and stored the same errors everyone had already seen. Preston folded his arms as though the result had settled the matter. Mason repeated the test twice, then reached for the temperature probe. He did not touch the central control unit Preston wanted replaced. He directed controlled heat toward the smaller relay housing mounted beside it, raising the temperature gradually while watching the meter. Evan leaned closer. Aaron moved beside Olivia. At 110 degrees, nothing changed. At 125, the fan command arrived late. At 132, the voltage dropped for less than a second, then returned. The warning light flashed once, paused, and flickered twice. Mason removed the heat and waited. The voltage stabilized. He ran the test again. At nearly the same temperature, the signal collapsed. This time Evan saw it clearly. "The relay opens under load," he said. Preston's expression hardened. A transient reading does not prove component failure. Mason disconnected the meter and removed the smallest relay from the box. One terminal showed a faint dark line along the contact edge. He held it beneath the service light, then looked toward Olivia. "This is where the system gives up," he said. "It is not why." Mason placed the failed relay on the clean service mat and looked back into the open compartment. Olivia had expected him to replace it immediately. Preston appeared to expect the same thing, because he stepped closer and said the diagnosis was now complete. Mason did not answer. He followed the wiring from the relay housing to the connector with the amber discoloration, then used the temperature probe again, this time holding it near the terminal block rather than the relay itself. The reading climbed faster there. Evan watched over his shoulder. "That connector should not be running that hot," he said. Preston responded before anyone else could. "It has been under repeated test cycles for hours." Mason touched the insulation lightly with the back of one finger, then removed his hand. "The heat pattern is uneven." He loosened the retaining cover and exposed the terminal assembly beneath it. One side of the connector sat slightly lower than the other. The difference was small enough to disappear under showroom lighting, but not small enough to escape someone who had spent years learning how machines failed when everything looked almost right. Mason asked Evan for the dealership torque record from the vehicle's last service. Preston said it was irrelevant. Olivia turned toward him. "If it is irrelevant, there is no reason not to show it." Aaron opened the digital service file on her tablet and handed it to Evan. 6 weeks earlier, Sterling Crown Motors had replaced a nearby power distribution unit after a routine inspection found an intermittent communication warning. The repair order showed that the same connector had been removed and reinstalled. The torque field contained a technician identification number but no measured value. Mason looked at the terminal again. "It was tightened past specification," he said. The pressure had distorted the contact surface just enough to increase resistance as the connector warmed. The relay had carried the extra heat until the internal contact began opening under load. Replacing the relay would restore operation, but if the connector remained misaligned, the new part would fail again. Preston shook his head. "You cannot establish that from a visual inspection." Mason took a thin resistance lead from his tool roll and measured across the terminal while Evan applied a controlled load. The number rose steadily as the connector heated. Then Mason eased the fastener back by less than a quarter turn and reseated the terminal. The resistance dropped. No one spoke. Chloe looked up from her math worksheet, sensing the change before she understood it. Mason reached into one of the clear plastic sleeves and removed a standard replacement relay. The label from his supplier showed a retail price of $14.12. He installed it, checked the terminal alignment again, and stepped away from the vehicle. Olivia moved toward the driver's seat, but Mason raised one hand. "Wait." He ran the heat load test a third time. Voltage held. The fan command arrived on time. The warning light remained dark. Only then did he nod. Olivia pressed the start control. The engine turned once, caught, and settled into a smooth idle that filled the showroom with a deep, even sound. 3 seconds passed without anyone saying a word. Evan stared at the stable readings. Erin lowered her tablet. Chloe smiled and rolled the red toy car across her knee. Preston looked at the new relay, then at Mason. "So that was it," he said. Mason kept his eyes on the open connector. "That was the part that failed." He pointed to the distorted terminal. "This is what made it fail." The engine continued idling while Mason watched the temperature readings climb through the range that had triggered the failure minutes earlier. He did not close the service panel. He did not accept the nods beginning to pass between the technicians. A successful start meant the immediate fault had been removed. It did not explain why a connector serviced only 6 weeks earlier had been tightened far beyond specification. Olivia stepped out of the car and stood beside the open compartment, listening as the engine held a steady rhythm beneath the showroom lights. Preston recovered his composure first. "A relay failed," he said. "That happens." The larger estimate was based on the fault history available at the time. Mason kept the meter connected. The fault history came from this connection. "You cannot prove when the damage occurred." Erin looked down at the service file on her tablet. The repair order included standard inspection photographs, but only 3 images appeared in the customer copy. A 4th image slot showed a date and time with no visible attachment. She asked Evan whether technicians normally photographed every electrical connection before reassembly. Evan nodded. "Before and after, especially on a vehicle like this." Preston said archived images were routinely compressed or removed after a service file closed. Erin did not answer. She opened the dealership's internal maintenance portal and searched by the original work order number. The first 3 photographs matched Olivia's copy. The 4th remained hidden behind a supervisor restriction. Olivia looked toward Preston. "Who placed the restriction?" "He said it was probably automatic." Erin checked the authorization field. Preston Hale's name appeared beside the change. The showroom seemed to lose some of its brightness. Mason continued monitoring the circuit as the temperature rose past 140 degrees. Voltage remained steady. The new relay stayed closed. He removed the meter only after the test had held for 10 full minutes. Erin requested access to the restricted image. Preston refused, citing internal privacy rules. Olivia asked whether those rules applied to photographs of her own vehicle. Preston began explaining dealership policy, but she had stopped listening. She called the dealership's general manager from the showroom floor and asked him to release the complete service record. The image arrived less than 5 minutes later. Erin opened it beside the car. It showed the same connector immediately after the earlier repair, photographed beneath a work light. The terminal housing was already discolored. A handwritten inspection marker near the edge indicated abnormal heat. Mason studied the image without touching the tablet. The fastener position matched the one he had just corrected. Evan leaned closer and recognized the technician code beside the marker. The code belonged to Daniel Price, a junior technician who no longer worked at Sterling Crown. The service notes listed his concern as resolved, but there was no record of a resistance test, relay replacement, or customer notification. Olivia looked from the image to the original estimate still resting on the service counter. "You knew there was heat damage 6 weeks ago," she said. Preston's expression remained controlled, but his answer came slowly. A junior employee made an observation that was not confirmed. Mason pointed toward the stable meter reading. "It would have taken 1 load test to confirm it." Preston turned toward him. "You have altered the vehicle. Anything you claim now is impossible to verify independently." Chloe had finished her worksheet and stood just behind the yellow line, the red toy car held at her side. She looked at Mason, waiting to see whether he would argue. He did not. He removed the $14 relay, placed it inside a clear evidence bag from the service cart, and handed the bag to Erin. Then he photographed the corrected connector position, the old heat marks, and the live readings. "Do not take my word for it," he said. Have an independent engineer repeat every test. Olivia looked at Preston. We will. For the first time that afternoon, he had nothing ready to say. The independent engineer arrived before sunset, a gray-haired woman named Judith Lane who had spent 22 years auditing electrical failures for manufacturers, insurers, and federal recall investigations. She did not know Mason. She did not know Preston. Olivia had chosen her because no one in the room could reasonably claim otherwise. Judith repeated the heat load test with her own equipment, documented the voltage drop history, inspected the distorted terminal, and reviewed the service photograph taken 6 weeks earlier. Her conclusion matched Mason's in every material detail. The relay had failed because excess resistance at the over-tightened connector created repeated heat stress. The central control unit was functional. The power distribution module was functional. The drivetrain communication network was functional. The proposed replacement package had never been necessary. Preston stood near the service counter while Judith spoke, one hand resting on the tablet he had used to present the estimate. When she finished, he said the vehicle's condition had been altered before her inspection and that Mason's involvement had compromised the original evidence. Judith looked toward the sealed bag containing the failed relay, then toward the time-stamped diagnostic photographs Aaron had taken before and after the repair. The evidence is sufficient, she said. The modification corrected the fault. It did not create the prior heat damage. Preston shifted his attention to Olivia. His voice remained calm, but the patience had left it. He warned her that Sterling Crown Motors could not accept liability for unauthorized work and that Mason's garage might face legal action for interfering with a protected vehicle system. Chloe, still seated near the yellow line, looked toward her father. Can we go home now? She asked quietly. Mason glanced at the clock above the service office. It was nearly 6. Chloe had school the next morning, and he had promised they would eat dinner together at the small kitchen table in their apartment, not from paper containers in the garage. He could have left. The car ran. The immediate problem was solved. But Preston was already reshaping the story, turning a correct diagnosis into unauthorized interference and a hidden mistake into a dispute over procedure. Mason crouched beside Chloe and zipped her backpack. Soon, he said. Not until the truth is safe. He stood and asked Aaron to preserve copies of every service image, access record, estimate revision, and diagnostic timestamp. Preston objected, saying internal records belonged to the dealership. Olivia answered before Mason could. The records involve my vehicle and my account. Preserve them. Evan remained beside the service cart, visibly uneasy. Judith began preparing her written findings at a small desk. For several minutes, the only sounds were the engine idling and keys moving beneath her hands. Then Evan asked if he could speak privately. Preston told him to return to work. Evan did not move. He looked at Olivia instead. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel Price had filed an internal warning after discovering the overheated connector. Evan had seen the report because he helped photograph the repair. Daniel recommended replacing the relay, correcting the terminal alignment, and notifying the customer. The next morning, the warning disappeared from the active file. Daniel was transferred to another location and resigned 2 weeks later. Evan had saved a copy because the deletion felt wrong. Preston's face did not change, but his hand tightened around the tablet. Olivia asked where the copy was. Evan reached into his locker, RAM. The meeting began at 7:30 in the dealership's private conference room, after the showroom had closed and the last customer lights had been dimmed. Olivia sat at one end of the long glass table with Aaron beside her. Mason sat halfway down the opposite side, Chloe in a quiet lounge beyond the open door where she could see him while finishing her reading assignment. Judith Lane placed her written findings in front of the dealership's general manager, Robert Sterling, a careful man in his early 60s who had spent the first 10 minutes asking questions no one could answer without looking toward Preston. The failed relay rested inside its sealed bag at the center of the table. Beside it lay the original estimate, the restricted service photograph, Daniel Price's internal warning, and the test data showing the voltage collapse under heat. Preston remained standing near the wall. He said the documents were being interpreted without proper context. He said large repair estimates often accounted for risk, warranty exposure, and the possibility of cascading failure. He said no one could know whether the central modules might have failed later. Mason listened without interrupting. When Robert asked him to explain his conclusion, Mason did not begin with the estimate. He began with the circuit. He described how the warning light preserved a sequence, how the delayed fan command proved the control unit was still communicating, how the voltage remained stable when cold and failed only after resistance increased at the damaged connector. Judith repeated the measurements using her own equipment and confirmed that every major module Preston had proposed replacing remained functional. Mason placed the old relay beside the photograph from 6 weeks earlier. This part failed because that connection was damaged during service, he said. The warning was documented before the customer left. The test that would have confirmed it was never performed. Preston said Daniel Price had been inexperienced and overly cautious. Evan, seated near the door, lowered his eyes before speaking. Daniel had repeated the concern twice. Preston had told the team the customer would be offered a comprehensive repair package if the condition worsened. Aaron opened the access history from the service portal. The warning had not disappeared. Automatically. It had been removed under Preston's authorization less than 3 hours after it was filed. Robert took off his glasses and placed them on the table. No one moved. Olivia picked up the sealed relay, studied the small part through the plastic, then set it directly on top of the estimate. The contrast was so simple that no explanation improved it. Preston tried once more. He said the dealership had protected itself by recommending the safest possible repair. Olivia looked at him across the table. You recommended the most profitable repair after hiding the correct one. The room went still. Even the heating system seemed loud. Robert asked Judith whether replacing the full system had ever been technically justified. No, she said. Not by the evidence available then or now. Preston looked toward Mason as though waiting for triumph, accusation, or anger. Mason gave him none. He closed his tool roll and checked the time. Chloe appeared in the doorway holding her red toy car and a finished book report. Robert informed Preston that he was suspended effective immediately while every major electrical repair approved under his supervision was reviewed. Olivia remained seated after the others began gathering their papers. Her eyes stayed on the relay. $14.12 had restarted the car. What silenced the room was not the price. It was how many people had known the truth and chosen not to say it. The review began the next morning and did not stop with Olivia's car. Robert Sterling brought in an outside compliance firm to examine every major electrical repair approved during Preston's final 18 months at the dealership. By the end of the first week, investigators had identified 11 cases where full modules had been recommended even though internal notes pointed to smaller, reparable faults. Some customers had paid. Others had sold their vehicles rather than accept the estimates. Daniel Price returned long enough to confirm that he had raised concerns before resigning. Evan provided copies of additional service notes he had saved. Preston remained suspended while the dealership's attorneys prepared for a formal investigation. Mason did not follow the story through television reports or online comments. He returned to Mercer Street, opened his garage at 7 each morning, and worked through the same line of family cars, work trucks, and delivery vans that had filled his schedule before anyone at Sterling Crown knew his name. Chloe sat at the end of the workbench after school, rolling her red toy car between a stack of spelling cards and the sealed bag containing the old relay, which Mason had been allowed to keep after Judith completed her documentation. 3 days later, Olivia arrived without an appointment. She parked the repaired supercar at the curb but entered the garage alone, wearing a dark coat and carrying a narrow envelope. The space was smaller than she expected. 2 service bays, a tool wall Mason had built himself, a coffee maker balanced on a filing cabinet, and a child's drawings taped beside the invoice printer. Mason was replacing a wheel bearing on a postal van. He finished tightening the final fastener before walking over to her. Olivia handed him the envelope. Inside was a check large enough to change the next several years of his life. She called it a consulting fee, a reward, and an apology. Mason read the amount once, returned the check to the envelope, and handed it back. "The diagnostic fee is on the invoice," he said. Olivia looked toward the office where Chloe was doing homework. "You saved me from paying $200,000. I found a failed relay. You found what everyone else chose not to see." Mason wiped his hands on a shop towel. He did not argue with that, but he still refused the check. Olivia asked what would be fair. Mason pointed to the printed invoice on the counter: 2 hours of diagnostic labor, 1 replacement relay, and a small charge for testing materials. Nothing more. She paid it without negotiation. Then she placed a second folder on the counter. Sterling Crown Motors wanted Mason's garage to serve as an independent review shop for high-value repair estimates before customers approved them. Olivia had insisted on the condition as part of her continued business with the dealership. Mason read the proposal carefully. The compensation was reasonable. The authority was real. But one paragraph limited the service to premium clients and vehicles above a certain value. He crossed it out. "If the process is honest," he said, "it should not depend on what someone drives." Olivia looked at the grease-stained counter, the crowded waiting area, and the little red toy car beside the $14 relay. Then she took the pen and initialed the change. Over the next several months, Mason's Garage became the independent diagnostic partner for every disputed estimate at Sterling Crown, from imported sports cars to 10-year-old family sedans. Customers began arriving because they trusted the quiet mechanic who tested before replacing and explained before charging. Olivia visited twice more, not as a customer demanding answers, but as someone learning how much expertise could exist outside polished walls. Mason never asked her to apologize again. She never laughed at his work again. The relay had cost $14.12. The truth had cost reputations, contracts, and years of trust. Knowing where to look had taken Mason Reed a lifetime.